The smell of garlic and rosemary filled the air when the sound of skin hitting skin broke the silence. I froze, knife still in my hand, the blade hovering above a half-chopped onion. For a second, everything blurred: the counter, the sizzling pan, the reflection of my mother's face in the steel pot lid. Then the sting bloomed across my cheek, hot and sharp. My mother's voice cut through the haze. "You'll never cook like your sister." The words hit harder than her hand. Across the table, my sister Lydia paused mid-bite fork halfway to her mouth. My father cleared his throat but said nothing. Even my nephew kept eating his mashed potatoes as if nothing had happened. The world didn't stop for my humiliation. It never did. I tasted iron on my tongue and realized I'd bitten the inside of my cheek. I didn't even flinch this time. That was the part that scared me most, the quiet acceptance, the routine of it. I set the knife down carefully, afraid it might slip if I gripped it too tight. My mother turned back to the stove as if she'd just swatted a fly. She stirred the sauce with slow, deliberate motions, the same rhythm she used when she was angry but trying to look calm. The clinking of the wooden spoon against the pan filled the silence that no one dared to break. My father reached for his glass of water, pretending to be absorbed in the condensation dripping down the side. The television murmured faintly from the living room, some local news anchor talking about a storm warning, but the real storm was in this kitchen, and I was its quiet eye. I took a slow breath, staring at the thin line of steam rising from the pot. It curled like smoke from a candle that refused to go out. The smell of butter mixed with something metallic, something burnt. My mother wiped her hands on the towel hanging from her apron, the one embroidered with the words, "Family First." The irony almost made me laugh. Almost. Lydia leaned back in her chair and smirked. "Mom's right," she said. "You always cut wrong. You go too slow. Maybe if you cooked like you did your job, we'd actually eat before midnight." Her voice was honeyed venom, perfectly measured. I said nothing. Silence was safer. Silence kept the peace. Or at least the illusion of it. I turned back to the cutting board eyes stinging from the onions and from something else I refused to name. My mother's footsteps moved behind me, her slippers brushing softly against the tile. She hovered near my shoulder, inspecting every movement like a drill sergeant. Slower, she snapped. "You're making a mess!" She took the knife from my hand with a sharp clatter, slicing through the vegetables in quick, angry strokes. "See, like this. Efficient. Clean. Not that difficult, is it?" She shoved the cutting board aside and grabbed a pot from the rack. The metallic clanging echoed through the kitchen like a bell toll. Lydia chuckled and went back to her phone, scrolling, pretending not to watch. My father stayed silent, his fork scratching the plate in small, nervous circles. No one asked if I was okay. No one ever did. I turned to rinse my hands in the sink. The cold water numbed the heat in my cheek, but inside my chest the burn kept spreading. I stared out the window. The sky was turning a bruised shade of purple clouds gathering over the cornfields behind the house. The old wind chime by the porch swayed, letting out a hollow tune. My mother's reflection appeared beside mine in the glass. "You're 32, Emma. 32 and still can't handle a kitchen. I wonder how you manage your so-called nutrition job." Her tone made the word nutrition sound like an insult. I looked down at the sink drain and said nothing. She sighed, annoyed by my quiet. "You're just like your father. Passive. Weak." I gripped the edge of the counter until my knuckles whitened. The faucet hissed louder, drowning her out, but not enough. Behind us, Lydia's voice floated through the air again. "Don't bother teaching her, Mom. Some people just can't learn." She laughed, the kind of laugh that makes you want to disappear. My mother chuckled, softly proud. That was the moment the sound inside my head changed. The slap replayed, but this time I didn't feel pain. I felt space, distance, the awareness that every cruel word had become predictable background noise, that my silence had kept their world comfortable. The realization was both terrifying and freeing. I turned off the faucet and wiped my hands on the towel, the same towel that had wiped years of spilled soup, broken plates, and tears no one saw. Behind me, Lydia said something else, but her voice blurred into the hum of the refrigerator. The kitchen clock ticked steady and cruel. My mother moved past me again, bumping my shoulder on purpose, reclaiming the space as hers. "Watch it," she muttered. I stepped aside. My heart wasn't racing anymore. It had slowed to something steady, deliberate. I looked at the table, Lydia scrolling through her phone, my father pretending the food was worth his attention, my mother orchestrating everything like she always did. They looked small suddenly, fragile in their own ignorance. The power they held over me existed only because I allowed it. That thought arrived quietly, but once it did, it refused to leave. My mother ladled the sauce over the roast, humming tunelessly. She didn't notice that the candle near the stove had melted almost completely, its flame, trembling but still alive. She didn't see the way I stared at that flame, memorizing its shape. Warmth or warning, it flickered like a decision waiting to be made. I wiped my face once, slowly removing the last trace of her hand. My voice, when it came, was soft enough that no one turned to hear. "I'll finish dinner." My mother shrugged, already moving on. "Do it properly this time," she said. I took the knife back from the counter, steadied it above the cutting board, and sliced through the next onion cleanly. The rhythm was mechanical, controlled. Beneath it all, something inside me shifted, subtle but irreversible. The sound of the blade against wood mixed with the tick of the clock. Each beat measured the distance between who I had been and who I was about to become. I didn't know it yet, but this was the last meal I would ever cook in that house. The last night I would let their silence swallow mine, and as the candle burned down to nothing, I finally looked up and met my mother's eyes through the shimmer of heat rising from the stove. She blinked first. When I was little, my mother used to say that Lydia was born with sunlight in her hands and I was born with shadows. I never understood what she meant until I saw how people looked at us. Lydia could do no wrong. Her grades were perfect, her hair always shined, and even when she spilled milk on the table, Mom called it an accident. When I did the same thing, it was carelessness. The difference between us wasn't what we did, it was who they decided we were. By the time I turned 12, the pattern was carved into every corner of our house. Report cards hung on the refrigerator, Lydia's A's in bold ink, my B's tucked behind the grocery list. Mom's voice always came with comparison. "Lydia wins awards, Emma makes messes." I used to repeat it in my head while doing chores, as if saying it first would hurt less when she said it next. I remember one summer afternoon when Lydia won a local baking contest. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and applause. She was 15, I was 11, and Mom bought balloons that said, "Congratulations, Chef." I stood beside the counter washing dishes, still in my muddy shorts from soccer practice. Mom didn't notice me until I accidentally dropped a plate. It shattered. The laughter stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the yelling. I can still hear her voice, calm and cutting. "Of course it's you. You always break things." That was the first time I realized that no matter how clean I tried to live, I'd always be her broken dish. Years later, when Lydia got into culinary school, Mom threw a dinner party. I cooked most of the food. Lydia took the credit. Guests toasted to her talent while I carried plates back and forth like an invisible waitress. Dad smiled at her pride in his eyes. He never looked at me that way. He was a quiet man, more interested in sports and stocks than emotions. When he did speak, it was to tell me to stop taking things so personally. "It's just how your mother is," he'd say. Don't make her upset. But I was always the trigger. If Lydia was gold, I was the tarnish that kept the shine believable. I went to college on a scholarship, nutrition science, not culinary arts. Mom never said congratulations. She said, "So you'll be cooking in hospitals now." That's something. Her tone made it sound like a mistake. Lydia's graduation gift was a set of knives engraved with her initials. Mine was a cookbook labeled for beginners. I laughed when I opened it, but my chest ached for weeks after. When I got my first job at a food research lab in Columbus, Mom didn't even tell her friends. She said I was working somewhere in food, like it was embarrassing. Meanwhile, Lydia opened a restaurant in Cincinnati with Mom's help. I designed part of her menu, focusing on balanced meals for diabetic customers. She never credited me publicly. Every time a review praised the nutritional design, Lydia would smile across the table and say, "Emma's just good with numbers." I let it slide. I always let it slide. Family peace cost silence, and I paid in installments. Holidays were the worst. Mom would invite neighbors, brag about Lydia's restaurant, then look at me and say, "Our Emma's still doing her diet thing." She said diet thing like it was a hobby for lonely people. I used to laugh it off, hiding my humiliation behind polite smiles. The only person who ever noticed was my grandmother before she passed. She once pulled me aside, her voice thin as paper. "Don't lose your kindness, Em. Kindness becomes power when everyone else forgets how to be decent." At the time, I didn't believe her. But those words lingered like a soft echo I couldn't shake. After Grandma died, the house got meaner. Mom's temper sharpened. Lydia's ego grew. Dad retreated into the TV. I moved back home briefly after grad school trying to save money, and that's when the comparisons became weapons. Mom called me lazy for not moving out faster, said Lydia, already owned a business while I wasted time testing formulas. I reminded her that my research was used in children's hospitals. She said hospitals don't make headlines. Restaurants do. The night she said that, Lydia came over with a bottle of wine and new designer shoes. She left her receipt on the table, paid with a card under both our names. That's when I realized she'd used my joint account from years ago. I confronted her quietly. She laughed and said, "Relax, you never check anyway. You're lucky to be part of something successful." Mom overheard and took her side. Of course she did. Lydia's success was Mom's reflection, and I was the smudge she couldn't scrub off. Still, I stayed. Out of guilt. Out of habit. Maybe out of some childish hope that one day she'd look at me and see more than the girl who couldn't cook like her sister. Every attempt I made to connect ended in criticism. When I brought home groceries, she complained I spent too much. When I fixed her sink, she said a man would have done it better. When I bought her a birthday cake, she said Lydia's were prettier. Every compliment to my sister was a needle, every conversation a wound reopened. Yet somehow I kept coming back to that kitchen trying to earn approval that had never been for sale. The worst part wasn't the cruelty, it was the normalization. The way everyone around us pretended it was fine, because that's just family. In America, people love to talk about forgiveness, but they never mention how often it's demanded from the same people who were never protected. I didn't understand boundaries back then. I thought endurance was love. When I moved out again, I sent money home each month to help with Dad's medical bills. Lydia never did. Mom still called her the good one. I used to lie awake in my apartment staring at the ceiling, wondering what exactly it took to be seen as enough. My coworkers admired my discipline, my quiet focus. None of them knew it came from years of trying not to be a disappointment. Sometimes when I closed my eyes, I'd still hear her voice. Lydia wins awards, Emma makes messes. It wasn't just a sentence. It was a curse stitched into my identity. I spent my 20s trying to unlearn it and my 30s pretending I had. Then slowly, I began to realize something else. My mother's approval was never about me. It was about control. The comparisons weren't meant to motivate, they were meant to measure obedience. Lydia thrived because she mirrored what Mom wanted to see. I didn't, so I became the problem. The moment I saw that truth, the hurt began to turn into resolve. I stopped waiting for her to change and started planning how I could. The night that broke the pattern didn't announce itself with thunder or warning. It began like any other Sunday in the Caldwell house with the smell of roast chicken and the dull hum of the old refrigerator. Lydia was visiting for the weekend, which meant my mother was performing for an audience. She'd spent the entire day cleaning the house and criticizing me for not wiping the counters fast enough. By 6, the table was set, the candles lit, and I was back in the kitchen helping to finish dinner. The irony wasn't lost on me. Lydia was the chef, yet I was the one cooking under orders. Mom stood behind me, arms crossed, watching every move I made like she was waiting for me to fail. When the pot lid clattered, she flinched in exaggerated annoyance. "Careful, Emma. You handle everything like it's your first time." Lydia laughed softly, her gold bracelet catching the light. "Don't be so hard on her, Mom. She means well." The words were sweetened poison, and Mom smiled, falling for it as always. I stirred the sauce quietly, trying to ignore the weight pressing on my shoulders. My father was already seated at the table, reading something on his phone, pretending not to hear. The sound of my own breathing seemed too loud. Dinner at our house always felt like a stage play where I was cast as the unfunny understudy. Every movement mattered. Every silence carried judgment. Mom began setting plates on the counter. "Lydia, help your sister," she said, though we both knew she didn't mean it kindly. Lydia walked over, perfume filling the air, and took the ladle from my hand. "You're still too slow," she whispered near my ear. "Watch and learn." Her tone wasn't instructional. It was ownership. She scooped the sauce gracefully and poured it over the chicken, careful not to spill a drop. Mom beamed. "That's how a woman should move in her kitchen," she said proudly. Her kitchen. The words hit me harder than I expected. I bit my tongue until I tasted copper. The kitchen was the only place in that house where I ever felt remotely useful, and even that had never been mine. Lydia placed the dish in the center of the table like a trophy presentation. Everyone took their seats. I stayed standing, adjusting the napkins, pretending I had a reason not to sit. Mom gestured impatiently. "Come on, Emma, it's getting cold." I sat. Lydia poured wine for everyone except me. I reached for the glass pitcher of water instead, hand-steady eyes fixed on the tablecloth pattern. It was floral faded from years of washing, much like everything in this house. Dinner started in relative peace. Conversation revolved around Lydia's restaurant expansion and some article about her in a local magazine. Mom listened with delight, asking questions like an eager journalist. Dad nodded approvingly, chewing methodically. I kept quiet, cutting small pieces of chicken I couldn't swallow. When Lydia mentioned hiring a nutrition consultant for her new menu, I felt a flicker of something close to irony. I was a nutritionist. My input had built her first menu years ago, but she didn't look at me. Not once. Mom sighed dramatically. "I told everyone you'd be successful," she said to Lydia. "Didn't I say that, Harold?" My father nodded. "I told them my daughter was destined for greatness." Then she turned to me, eyes narrowing. "You could learn from her, Emma. Maybe if you stopped working on those strange lab projects and actually did something people could see." I wanted to say something, to defend myself, to remind her that my work helped patients recover faster after surgery. But what would be the point? She wasn't asking for an answer. She was building her sermon. I looked at my plate. The chicken skin glistened perfect and golden. My reflection stared back faintly in the surface of the gravy. Lydia's voice rose again, casual but cutting. "You still working that same job? I heard the company's downsizing. Maybe it's time to switch careers. Something less scientific." Her tone implied less important. Mom chuckled, sipping her wine. "I told her that months ago. She's stubborn. Always has been." The conversation rolled on, bouncing between them like I wasn't there. I chewed without tasting. The candle beside the breadbasket flickered and hissed. My eyes burned. Then, as I reached to pick up a serving spoon, my elbow brushed a glass. It tipped spilling red wine across the white tablecloth. The liquid spread quickly, blooming like a wound. The room went silent. Mom's eyes widened. Lydia froze mid-sentence. I grabbed a napkin, instinctively dabbing at the stain. "Sorry," I whispered. Mom's voice came out sharp and cold. Of course it's you, always ruining something." She stood, yanking the napkin from my hand. "Look at this mess. Can't even sit still without causing chaos." Lydia smirked, and something inside me cracked. I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came. Mom took a deep breath, as if summoning patience, and then she slapped my hand away from the table. Not hard, not like before, just enough to remind me where I stood. The sting wasn't physical anymore. It was symbolic. I looked up slowly, meeting her eyes. Her expression was pure irritation, not guilt. That hurt more than anything. Behind her, the candle flame wavered, stretching tall before shrinking again. The air felt heavy. I could hear my own pulse. For a moment, I thought I might cry. Then I didn't. Instead, I smiled faintly. That's when I realized I'd reached my limit. I could stay quiet forever, or I could let silence burn. Lydia noticed the change in my face. She blinked, unsettled. Mom frowned. "What's that look?" she demanded. "Nothing," I said softly. "Just thinking how calm fire looks before it spreads." No one understood what I meant, but the words hung there long after I left the table. I stood, excused myself, and walked back to the kitchen. The candle by the stove flickered again, its flame mirrored in the pot lid like an omen. I wiped my hands, cleaned the counter, and stared at the empty sink. My reflection in the window was pale but steady. The storm outside had finally started. Rain tapped against the glass like distant applause. In the living room, laughter resumed muffled through the walls as if nothing had happened. But something had. The quiet had changed shape. It wasn't submission anymore. It was strategy. I dried my hands and whispered to myself, "It's time." I stayed in the kitchen long after the dishes were done. The house had gone quiet except for the faint buzz of the refrigerator and the steady rain outside. The dining room lights were off now, but I could still see the faint outline of wine stains on the tablecloth through the open door. My mother had gone to bed. Lydia had left humming a victory tune, and Dad had retreated to his recliner with the television turned low. It was the same routine every Sunday, but something inside me was shifting. I wasn't trembling anymore. I felt hollow and focused, like a machine recalibrating. The slap, the mockery, the silence, they had stopped feeling like pain. They had become data points, patterns, and patterns could be studied, predicted, dismantled. I rinsed the last glass and watched the water spiral down the drain. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like crying. I felt curious. How did we get here? How did I allow it? And more importantly, how could I undo it? I turned off the faucet and leaned against the counter. My hands were still red from scrubbing. My reflection in the dark window stared back at me with a look I hadn't seen before, calm calculation. The kind scientists wear when they're about to run an experiment that might change everything. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. My mother moving to her bedroom, no doubt muttering about how ungrateful I was. I didn't care. My laptop was on the kitchen island where I'd left it earlier that afternoon. I opened it. The light from the screen illuminated the empty room, casting blue shadows across the counters. My email inbox blinked with old receipts, account summaries, invoices, breadcrumbs I'd ignored for years. I clicked through them slowly. There it was, a bank transfer from 2 years ago, another from last year, another from 3 months ago. Every one of them labeled as reimbursement. Only they never reimbursed me. Rent, groceries, medical bills, the down payment Lydia had used to open her restaurant, all from my accounts. My stomach clenched, not from shock, but from recognition. I'd known, deep down. I just never wanted to face it. I pulled out a binder from the cabinet beneath the counter. It was the same one I used for recipe testing notes back when I still believed Mom's approval was something to earn. The cover was cracked, but the pages were blank. Perfect. I started printing every transaction, every email, every receipt that tied me to the money trail. The printer whirred quietly in the corner like a loyal accomplice. By the time the rain had stopped, a neat stack of papers sat in front of me, evidence of 7 years of exploitation disguised as family support. I labeled it the Caldwell Project. It wasn't revenge, it was documentation. My training as a nutrition scientist had taught me that numbers don't lie, emotions do. I spent the next 3 hours building a timeline. Year by year, I mapped every financial favor I'd done for them, each mortgage payment, each medical copay, each utility bill I'd covered. By midnight, the total hit just over $290,000. My fingers tightened around the pen. My throat ached from holding my breath. That's when I noticed something else. Attached to one of the emails from Lydia was a scanned document, her restaurant partnership agreement. I opened it. My name sat quietly on page 3 next to the words Initial Investor, Percentage Ownership 40%. I blinked. I remembered signing something when she first started the restaurant, back when she'd called me crying about needing funds for kitchen equipment. She'd promised to pay me back with interest. I'd never seen a cent. Now, reading the clause buried near the bottom, I realized I didn't just fund her dream. I owned nearly half of it. I laughed softly. The sound was strange in the stillness, half amusement, half disbelief. My mother always said I was slow, but this was the kind of slowness that catches up all at once and changes everything. I took photos of every page, saved backups to 2 drives, then emailed copies to my work account. I'd been invisible in this family for so long that the idea of them seeing me clearly even for a moment felt revolutionary. At 1:30, I made a cup of tea and sat at the table. The candle near the stove was almost gone, a thin column of wax with a stubborn flame. I stared at it and thought about the phrase Mom embroidered on her apron, family first. Maybe that's what I had been doing all along, putting family first until I disappeared. But family without respect isn't love, it's labor. And I was done working for free. I opened another document, an unfinished letter to my mother I'd started months ago and never sent. I began typing again. I wrote about boundaries, about exhaustion, about wanting peace. But halfway through I stopped. This letter wasn't for her. It was for me. She wouldn't understand it. She wasn't ready to. I deleted the file. What I needed wasn't explanation. It was action. I created a new folder and titled it Transition. Inside, I added subfolders Legal, Financial, Personal. Under Legal, I stored my ownership proof. Under Financial, I added bank statements and bills. Under Personal, I placed scanned photos of Grandma, the only person who ever saw me. It felt symbolic sorting chaos into order. I checked the clock. 2:40 a.m. My body was tired, but my mind hummed with clarity. I thought of Lydia's smug smile, Mom's dismissive tone, Dad's silence. None of them realized the foundation beneath them was already shifting. They'd built their comfort on me, and I had finally decided to stop holding it up. I sent one last email to a lawyer I'd once met during a university partnership project. His name was Ethan Monroe, a quiet, intelligent man who'd helped our lab navigate licensing agreements. Subject line: Request for consultation regarding business partnership inquiry. I attached the restaurant documents, added a short note. Need to review ownership rights and potential breach. Please advise next steps. I hit send. It was done. No fireworks, no revenge speech, just quiet progress. I closed the laptop and looked around the kitchen one last time. The tablecloth had been replaced, the dishes stacked the floor spotless. It looked like any ordinary night. Only, it wasn't. The air itself felt different, charged with something invisible but certain. The candle flickered once more before dying, leaving a thin trail of smoke curling upward like an exhale. I whispered to the empty room goodbye and meant it in ways they would never understand. Upstairs, my mother's door creaked again, and I heard her cough, muttering to herself. She would wake up tomorrow believing she still ruled this house. For now, she did. But not for long. The storm outside had ended. The storm inside me had just begun. Morning light crept through the blinds like a quiet witness. I hadn't slept. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, sitting untouched beside the laptop. The kitchen looked cleaner than it ever had, almost sterile. Maybe because for the first time I was looking at it not as my mother's kitchen, but as a scene of evidence. Every corner of this house carried a history of small humiliations, and now each of them had turned into data points, documents, transactions, proof. At 7, I heard footsteps upstairs. The day was beginning like any other, but I wasn't part of it anymore. My mother's voice floated down the stairs, sharp as always. "Emma, don't forget to take the trash out before work." The command hit differently now. I looked at the binder on the counter. Not today. I left the kitchen without answering. At 9, I parked outside the public library downtown and carried my binder to a quiet table in the back corner. It smelled of paper and dust and a kind of safety I hadn't felt in years. I connected my laptop to the Wi-Fi and opened an email from Ethan. He'd replied at 6 in the morning. "Good to hear from you, Emma. I've reviewed the documents briefly. Based on your ownership percentage and lack of payout, you may have a strong legal standing. Let's discuss further this week." His tone was professional but warm. Reading his words felt like a door opening. I replied with gratitude, attaching a more detailed summary of my financial contributions. As I typed, I realized how meticulous I had been all these years, saving receipts, labeling transfers. My mother had mocked my need for order, but it turned out to be my defense. When the email was sent, I leaned back and closed my eyes for a moment. The past 7 years replayed behind them, the loans, the reimbursements that never came, the guilt trips disguised as gratitude. Mom's voice echoed from memory. "We'll pay you back when we can, sweetie. You know family doesn't keep tabs." But family had kept tabs, just not for my benefit. I opened my online banking app again and stared at the totals. Rent payments under my name, property taxes paid from my account, Lydia's business expenses labeled as shared. The more I traced, the more the truth revealed itself. I wasn't a helper. I was the backbone they pretended didn't exist. Around noon, I received another message from Ethan. Do you have digital copies of all transfers and a record of communication? I typed yes, then paused. I also have voice recordings. It wasn't something I planned. Over the years, I had started recording calls out of habit whenever my mother's tone shifted from sweet to hostile. It was partly for self-protection, partly because I needed to prove to myself I wasn't imagining it. I scrolled through my phone now and found one from last year. Mom's voice impatient, Emma, stop worrying about bills. You make good money and Lydia needs a head start. Be supportive for once in your life. My reply had been quiet. I always am. Listening to it now, I heard something new. The tone beneath my calm was exhaustion, and exhaustion had finally turned into clarity. I uploaded the recording to the same folder labeled legal and added a note for Ethan. Possible verbal admission. He replied minutes later. That's excellent documentation. Do not share these with your family yet. We'll handle this properly. Properly. That word felt foreign in the context of my family. At home, nothing had ever been proper. Everything was emotional, reactive, manipulative. Logic was treated as rebellion. Now logic was my weapon. I left the library and drove to a cafe a few blocks away. The place was warm and quiet, filled with the smell of baked bread and espresso. Sitting near the window, I opened my binder again and studied the timeline I'd built. There was a pattern hidden beneath the chaos. Every time I had gained stability, new job bonus promotion, there was a matching withdrawal from my account within months labeled as family emergency. I highlighted each one in red. It looked like a heartbeat. Their survival had been tied to my success. It explained so much the way they kept me close the guilt trips whenever I mentioned moving to another city. I wasn't a daughter. I was infrastructure. I thought of my mother's favorite phrase whenever I confronted her about money. Families share everything. She used it like a moral code, but it was really a leash. I sipped my coffee slowly and watched people outside hurry through the drizzle. None of them knew how freeing it felt to see the math of your own exploitation. Around 3, my phone buzzed. Lydia. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. Her voice was bright, rehearsed. Hey, Em. Just checking if you can send the tax forms for the restaurant again. Mom said you still have them. I stared out the window. You mean the ones with my name on them? There was a pause, barely a second long, but I heard the panic under her laugh. Oh, those… Yeah, just old paperwork. I'm cleaning files for the accountant. I didn't respond. The silence stretched. She shifted tone. Look, I know Mom's been rough lately. Don't take it personally. You know how she gets. I almost smiled at how predictable it was, the soft approach before the favor. I'll send what's mine, I said evenly. She hesitated. What's yours? She repeated, voice tightening. You'll see, I replied and hung up. My pulse stayed steady. That was new. No guilt, no racing heart, just calm. By evening, Ethan and I had scheduled a meeting for Wednesday morning. He would walk me through filing a formal ownership claim and possibly a reimbursement agreement. It sounded clinical, but to me it felt like reclaiming oxygen. I packed up the binder ready to leave, but one last thought stopped me. My mother had always said I didn't understand family values. Maybe she was right. Her version of family was built on hierarchy and silence. Mine, the one I was about to build, would be built on fairness. I drove home slowly, rehearsing nothing. When I pulled into the driveway, the house glowed with its usual soft light. The windows were fogged from dinner steam. Through the kitchen window, I could see my mother moving about, her silhouette familiar yet distant. For the first time, I felt no urge to go inside. I sat in the car and let the engine hum beneath me. My phone buzzed again, another message from Lydia. Don't do anything stupid, it read. That was when I knew she understood something had shifted. They could sense it even without proof. I took a deep breath and whispered to myself, not stupid, strategic. The rain started again, tapping softly on the windshield. Inside the house, a shadow passed the curtain, Mom probably checking if I'd come in yet. I let her wonder. Tomorrow I would meet Ethan in person. Tomorrow the truth would stop being hidden. I planned it for a week, every detail as precise as a lab protocol. The invitation was handwritten, calm, polite. Dinner at my place Sunday at 6. Mom, Lydia, and Dad all confirmed within an hour. Guilt was their leash, and I'd learned exactly how to tug it. The day arrived cloudless, deceptively peaceful. I spent the morning cleaning, rearranging, setting the table with the same white plates my mother used for holidays. The candle in the center was vanilla, her favorite scent, because I wanted every part of this to feel familiar before it shattered. By 4, the roast was in the oven, the kitchen spotless, my laptop open on the counter. I checked the files one last time: bank statements, signed contracts, emails, and the notarized document Ethan had prepared. The folder glowed on the desktop like a loaded weapon waiting to be fired. At 5:58, headlights swept across the window. I wiped my hands on a towel and straightened my blazer. I'd chosen Navy Professional Detached. The doorbell rang. My mother entered first, wrapped in her coat like a queen arriving at her throne. She sniffed the air approvingly. "Smells good. Let's hope it tastes better than last time." Lydia followed, heels clicking against the tile, her smile bright but brittle. Dad trailed behind, carrying a bottle of wine he hadn't paid for. I greeted them evenly. No hugs, no warmth. Just civility sharp enough to cut. Dinner started quietly. We sat in the dining room where the walls still bore faint scuffs from years of family dinners gone wrong. Mom dominated the conversation as usual, recounting church gossip, while Lydia nodded, pretending interest. Dad ate in silence. It was almost comforting how predictable they were. When Lydia finally asked about my job, her tone was casual, but her eyes were testing. "Still doing your little research thing?" I smiled. "Something like that." My mother set down her fork. "You should come work with your sister. She could use someone organized." Lydia smirked. "You'd be perfect at washing dishes." The old me would have laughed weakly or excused myself. Not tonight. I poured myself a glass of water and said, "Actually, I already work with her." The silence that followed was immediate and thick. Mom frowned. "What do you mean?" I turned to Lydia, who had gone perfectly still. "I mean that I own 40% of your restaurant." I slid the folder from under the table and placed it beside my plate. Lydia's face drained of color. "That's not—" I opened the folder, revealing the partnership agreement, her signature looping neatly beside mine. Page 3. "You asked for funding. I gave you $200,000. You never paid me back, and the contract clearly states I maintain 40% ownership until full repayment." Lydia's mouth opened and closed. Mom snatched the document, scanning it like she could erase the words with her glare. "This doesn't mean anything," she said. "Family doesn't sue family." I didn't look at her. "Family doesn't steal from family either." The words came out soft, steady, and absolute. Lydia slammed her hand on the table. "You're twisting this. You said it was a gift." I met her eyes. "I said it was help. You turned it into dependence." Mom rose from her chair, voice rising. "Enough of this drama. You're trying to ruin your sister's life because you're jealous." The accusation was old, rehearsed, but this time it didn't pierce. I pushed the next folder toward her. Bank statements, rent payments, medical bills. 7 years of transactions, every cent I covered for this family while you told everyone I was ungrateful. Her eyes flicked down the pages, scanning the totals. Her lips trembled, but pride wouldn't let them soften. "You should be ashamed," she muttered. "Bringing paperwork to dinner." I leaned back. "I learned it from watching you, Mom. You taught me that appearances matter more than truth, so tonight I brought both." Dad finally spoke, voice weary. "Emma, you don't have to do this here." I looked at him. "When should I—" "After another decade of pretending." He said nothing. The clock ticked slow and cruel. Lydia reached for her phone. "I wouldn't," I said quietly. "I already sent copies to the lawyer and the bank." She froze. "You're bluffing." The laptop screen behind me came to life as if on cue, displaying the folder labeled The Caldwell Project. Documents filled the screen, proof undeniable. Lydia's hand shook. "You can't take the restaurant. You don't know how to run it." I smiled faintly. "I don't have to. I just have to take what's mine." Mom's voice cracked like breaking glass. "After everything we've done for you." I turned to her. "What exactly have you done for me?" "Mom raised me on insults, trained me to disappear so you could shine through Lydia." She slapped her palm on the table, the echo loud. "Don't talk to me that way. I'm your mother." I met her fury with calm. "You're the woman who taught me what silence costs. and tonight I'm done paying." For a long moment, no one moved. The candle flickered wax dripping down its side like a slow countdown. Finally, Lydia's mask crumbled. "You wouldn't actually go through with legal action? This is just to scare us." I looked at her with a softness that wasn't pity, just recognition. "You're scared because you finally see I can." Mom sank back into her chair, whispering to herself, "You'd destroy this family for money." I shook my head. "No, you destroyed it for control. I'm just reclaiming the receipts." The words hung there like smoke. The air felt electric fragile. Dad cleared his throat again. "Maybe we can talk this out quietly," he offered. I turned toward him. "Quiet is how this started. I'm done with quiet." I stood, gathered the papers, and placed them back into the binder. The clatter of the rings snapping shut sounded final. Lydia's voice wavered. "Please, Em, we can fix this." I looked at her, the sister who had once shared secrets and now shared guilt. "You hit me with words for years. Mom hit me with her hand. But the truth? The truth hits harder." I walked to the counter, picked up the envelope resting by the sink, and placed it in front of them. It bore a red notary seal. Inside was the updated ownership document transferring control of my investment. Ethan had filed it that morning. Mom's hand trembled as she reached for it but didn't open it. "What is this?" she whispered. "The house," I said quietly. "It's mine now." Their faces froze. Lydia stammered, You can't do that." I met her gaze. I already did. The room was silent except for the low hum of the fridge. The candle burned low, the scent of vanilla thick and suffocating. I looked at it, then back at them. "You hit me for not cooking well enough," I said evenly. "But you built your life on what I paid for." Mom's eyes filled with something I hadn't seen before, fear. Not of me, but of consequence. I didn't gloat. I didn't shout. I simply gathered my keys. The sound of them jingling was louder than any argument we'd ever had. As I reached the door, Lydia whispered, "What are you going to do now?" I paused, turning just enough to meet her gaze. "I'm going to eat dinner somewhere peaceful." Then I left them in that kitchen, their kingdom of control collapsing quietly behind me. 2 days later, the first call came just after sunrise. Lydia's name flashed across the screen, followed by 3 missed calls in less than a minute. I didn't answer. My coffee steamed quietly beside the kitchen sink, the only sound in the apartment. I had already sent Ethan everything he needed. The previous night, he'd filed the ownership claim and notified the restaurant's financial department of the pending legal inquiry. By morning, the truth was no longer just my secret. It was in motion, official, irreversible. When the 4th call came, I picked up curiosity stronger than emotion. Lydia's voice was frantic. "What did you do? You ruined everything." "The investors are panicking. The accountant called Mom crying." I took a sip of coffee before answering. "I sent documentation, that's all. You're the one who ruined it by pretending I didn't exist." She started crying, real or rehearsed, I couldn't tell. "Please, Em, we can fix this quietly. Withdraw the claim and we'll figure out a way to make it right." I almost laughed. Quietly, I repeated, "That's the word you all love, the silence that keeps everything neat." Not this time. I hung up before she could respond. My phone buzzed again, this time a text from Ethan. "Meeting with opposing counsel scheduled Friday morning. You're doing fine." That line. "You're doing fine" carried more warmth than anything my family had said to me in a decade. I replied with a simple thank you and turned the phone face down. The next 48 hours unfolded like a slow avalanche. Word spread fast in our small Ohio town. By Wednesday, whispers reached even the grocery store where Mom shopped every Tuesday morning. I knew because a friend from high school texted me, "Your mom was here today. Looked pale. People are talking." I didn't feel satisfaction, just a strange stillness. The storm I had unleashed wasn't revenge, it was math balancing itself. Thursday evening, Ethan called. His tone was calm, measured. "They've retained local counsel. We'll meet at the courthouse for an informal mediation before it escalates. I want you to stay factual and polite. You have all the evidence on your side." I nodded even though he couldn't see me. "I'll be fine." He paused. I know you will. That night I barely slept, not from fear, but anticipation. The candle on my windowsill burned down to nothing again. In the morning, I dressed in a gray suit I hadn't worn since my graduation ceremony. The reflection staring back at me in the mirror didn't look like a daughter. She looked like a witness. At 8:45, I arrived at the courthouse. Ethan was waiting by the steps, his expression professional but reassuring. Lydia and Mom stood across the courtyard flanked by a man in a dark suit, probably their attorney. Lydia's eyes were swollen, her hair hastily pinned. Mom looked furious and brittle like glass under pressure. When she saw me, her expression twisted. You did this to your own family, she hissed as I passed. I didn't stop walking. Inside, the air smelled of paper and disinfectant. The clerk directed us to a small conference room with a long oak table. The judge assigned to mediation entered an older woman with a calm face and a voice like tempered steel. Let's begin! Ethan opened his binder, laying out the printed evidence in neat order. Partnership agreement, financial records, proof of payment. Everything documented, time-stamped, notarized. The opposing attorney tried to interrupt twice, but the judge raised a hand. Let her finish. Lydia fidgeted beside Mom, eyes darting between the papers and my face. When it was their turn, the lawyer spoke quickly. There was never intent to defraud. It was a family arrangement. My client simply misunderstood the financial structure. The judge looked unimpressed. Misunderstanding doesn't erase signatures. Mrs. Caldwell, did you or your daughter make any attempt to repay Ms. Caldwell? Mom hesitated, eyes narrowing. We don't owe her anything. Families help each other. The judge's tone sharpened. Families also respect legal agreements. Silence. Ethan slid another document forward, a copy of an email Lydia had sent me last year thanking me for the loan. The word loan was underlined. The judge read it, then looked up. This is clear acknowledgement of debt. She turned to Lydia. Do you dispute this email? Lydia's voice was barely a whisper. No, ma'am. The judge nodded. Then here's what will happen. Ms. Caldwell retains 40% ownership pending full repayment with interest. Failure to comply will result in formal transfer of operational control to her legal representative. Mom gasped. You can't let this stand. She's my daughter. The judge's voice stayed even. Exactly, which is why you should have treated her like one. The sentence landed like thunder in the small room. Lydia started to cry. I didn't gloat. I simply gathered my notes, sliding them back into the binder. When the mediation ended, Ethan shook my hand firmly. That's the cleanest outcome we could ask for. They'll try to negotiate privately, but you hold all the leverage now. As we stepped outside, the air smelled like rain again, heavy and fresh. Mom was waiting by the steps. She looked smaller somehow, her coat buttoned wrong. Lydia stood a few feet away, staring at the ground. Mom's voice cracked. You've humiliated us. People are talking. I met her eyes. They're finally talking about the truth. She lifted her hand slightly as if to reach for me, but stopped halfway. You think this makes you powerful? No, I said quietly. It makes me free. She shook her head, her fury trembling beneath every word. You'll regret this. Maybe, I said, but at least the regret will be mine. Ethan touched my shoulder lightly, guiding me toward his car. The ride back was silent, except for the sound of wipers moving across glass. When we stopped at a red light, he glanced at me. You handled yourself well. I watched the rain slide down the windshield. It's strange, I said. I thought I'd feel triumphant, but all I feel is tired. That's how healing starts, he replied, not with applause, just quiet. When I got home, the apartment felt unfamiliar in its calm. The binder sat on the counter edges, slightly bent from the day's handling. I poured a glass of water and leaned against the sink. The reflection in the window looked the same as before, yet everything had changed. My phone buzzed once more, a new message from Lydia. We lost one of the investors. I hope you're happy. I typed back a single line. Happiness has nothing to do with it. Then I turned off the phone, blew out the candle, and let the room go dark. By the end of that week, everyone in town knew. In a place as small as Crestfield, secrets travel faster than cars. The story spread through the bakery, the post office, and the church parking lot. People lowered their voices when I passed them, pretending not to look. Some nodded politely, others just whispered. It didn't bother me. For once, the whispers weren't about what I'd done wrong, they were about what I'd finally done right. Lydia's restaurant shut its doors for a week officially for renovations, but everyone knew it was because the board had suspended her operational privileges. Her investors were gone. The local paper ran a tiny column ownership dispute under review. No names, but everyone connected the dots. I kept working at the lab, finishing reports, keeping my head down. My coworkers had seen the article too. One of them, a kind woman named Grace, stopped me in the hallway and said, "You don't owe anyone silence." It was the most comforting thing anyone had said in years. At night, I'd walk home through quiet streets lined with maple trees shedding their last yellow leaves. The air smelled like wood smoke. It was the first autumn I'd experienced without the usual dread of Sunday dinners. Freedom has a strange weight to it, light but unfamiliar, like carrying air that used to be lead. Mom hadn't called since the courthouse. Lydia had sent 2 more texts, one angry, one desperate. I didn't reply to either. Instead, I focused on rebuilding small things, my routines, my appetite, my sense of ownership over my own peace. I rented a small commercial kitchen space near the hospital where I worked and started experimenting again with meal prep designs for patients recovering from surgery. The hum of mixers, the scent of herbs, the orderliness of measurement, it felt like therapy. Some days I'd work until midnight alone, but content. On Thursdays, I started donating leftover meals to the nursing home down the street. The staff began calling them Emma boxes. That made me smile. The town's gossip shifted slowly. People who'd judged me now watched with curiosity. A woman at the grocery store whispered as I passed, "I heard she used to cook for her family, and they treated her like a maid. Now she owns the place." Another replied, "Good for her. Took guts to do that." They weren't wrong, it had taken every ounce of composure I had. Still, part of me wanted none of it, the attention, the speculation. I just wanted quiet. One evening, about 2 weeks after the mediation, I saw my father standing outside my apartment building. The sight froze me mid-step. He looked older, smaller, like the world had folded around him. His hands were buried in his coat pockets. I approached slowly. He didn't smile. "Thought I'd check on you," he said softly. "Mom's been sick over this." I leaned against the railing. "She's been sick over losing control, not over what she did." His eyes flickered away. "She doesn't see it that way. She never will." "That's the problem," I said. He nodded slowly, eyes glassy. "You know I should have stopped her years ago." I didn't. I was afraid of the fights. I told myself keeping peace was protecting you girls. But all I did was make silence look holy. His honesty caught me off guard. It wasn't an apology, but it was closer than anything I'd ever heard. I took a deep breath. "You can't rewrite it, Dad. You can only stop pretending it was love." He swallowed hard, looked at the ground, and nodded again. I could see the shame in the curve of his shoulders. Before he left, he reached into his pocket and handed me a small box. "Found this in the drawer," he said. "Mom told me to throw it away." Inside was the old silver lighter that had belonged to my grandmother, the initials E.C. engraved faintly on one side. The lighter that used to sit beside her candle during every dinner. I held it carefully. "Thanks." He hesitated. "You remind me of her, you know. Stubborn in the quiet way." I almost smiled. "That's not a bad thing." He shook his head. "No, it's not." He left without another word. I watched his figure fade down the street, swallowed by the shadows. For the first time, I felt pity for him. Not the kind that excuses, but the kind that understands weakness without letting it rule you. That night, I lit a new candle using the lighter. The small flame danced steady on the counter. The air smelled faintly of vanilla again, but softer now, less suffocating. In the reflection of the window, I saw my own face, tired, strong, no longer waiting for permission to exist. The next morning, an email from Ethan arrived. Final paperwork completed. Settlement secured. Funds will transfer next week. I stared at the screen, feeling nothing dramatic, just peace sliding quietly into place. Justice doesn't always come with celebration. Sometimes it comes with the simple sound of your own heartbeat returning to normal. I closed the laptop and went to the window. Outside, children were walking to school, their backpacks bouncing. Somewhere down the street, a wind chime played the same hollow tune I'd grown up with, but now it sounded different, like freedom, not nostalgia. The town would keep talking for a while, then it would move on. People always do. What mattered was that I had finally stopped living as a background character in my own life. I was still Emma Caldwell, daughter, sister, survivor, but now I was also the author, and no one could edit that again. It started with a voicemail on a Sunday morning. My phone buzzed while I was folding laundry, and my mother's voice spilled through the speaker thinner than I remembered. "Emma, it's your mother. We need to talk. Please call me." There was no command in her tone this time, no sharpness, just something brittle that cracked around the edges. I didn't call back. I'd spent my whole life answering her calls. This time, I let silence be my response. The following day, Lydia texted Mom's not well. "She's been crying nonstop. You should check on her." I stared at the message, remembering every time she had used tears as currency. Still, curiosity gnawed at me. By evening, I drove past the old house. The curtains were drawn, the front porch light flickered like a heartbeat. I didn't stop, but I slowed down enough to see her sitting by the window, head resting on her hand. She looked small, like a shadow shrinking in its own light. 2 days later, Dad called. His voice was rough, the way it gets when he's ashamed. "Your mother had a fall," he said. "Just a sprain, nothing broken. She wants to see you." I gripped the phone tighter. "Tell her I'm glad she's okay." That's all I said before hanging up. But that night, guilt crawled back like a ghost you thought you'd buried. I dreamed of her voice calling my name the way it sounded when I was 5, before disappointment became our language. On Wednesday, I found myself outside the hospital. I told myself I was just curious, just passing by, but my feet betrayed me. Room 312. Helen Caldwell. She was sitting upright when I walked in, her leg wrapped in bandages. The TV murmured in the corner, and the scent of antiseptic filled the air. She turned her head startled, then softened. "Emma, I didn't expect you." Her voice trembled on my name like it was something fragile. I stood by the doorway, unsure if I should cross the threshold. "You fell." She nodded, embarrassed. "Stairs. I guess I'm not as steady as I used to be." I moved closer but kept my distance. There was a long silence before she spoke again. "I've been thinking about what you said. About control. Maybe you were right." The words landed heavy because I had never heard her say I might be right. But then she looked away, her tone changing. "Still, you didn't have to humiliate us." I sighed. It wasn't about humiliation. It was about truth. She closed her eyes briefly. Truth hurts Emma. I wanted to tell her lies hurt longer. Instead, I said nothing. She reached for the bedside table, her hand shaking slightly as she picked up a small paper bag. She held it out to me. "Cinnamon twists. Your favorite." I blinked. "The same bakery from my childhood." I didn't take the bag. "Mom, this doesn't fix anything." Her eyes glistened. "I know, but I didn't know what else to do." "You never call. You never visit." "I didn't know how to be your mother." The words fell like stones. I met her gaze and said quietly, "Then don't ask me to be your forgiveness." Her lip trembled. "I'm losing everything, Emma. The house, the restaurant, my family." I shook my head. "You're losing control, not family." She looked at the blanket fingers twisting the fabric. "I never wanted to hurt you." I laughed softly. "You wanted to shape me, and when I didn't fit, you called it failure." Her shoulders sagged. "I'm tired," she whispered. For the first time, I believed her. I stood there for another minute, then said, "Rest. That's something you've never let anyone do." As I left the room, I caught my reflection in the glass door. Her face was visible behind me, old, frail, still clutching that paper bag. Pity flickered inside me but didn't stay. Outside, the evening air was cold and clean. I drove home in silence. That night, Lydia called again, her tone defensive. "You saw her, didn't you?" "She told me." "You think you're better than us now." I didn't answer. "You ruined everything," she snapped. "Mom's losing her mind over this." I almost said she'd lost it years ago, but stopped myself. Instead, I said, "Maybe she's finally seeing what she built." Lydia's breath hitched. "You're cruel." "No," I said calmly. "I'm honest." She hung up. The next morning, a letter arrived. No return address, but I recognized Mom's handwriting, instantly perfect cursive, each loop tight with control. I hesitated before opening it. Inside, a single page. Emma, I don't know how to undo what I've done. Your father says you're right about the money. He doesn't understand that it was never about money. It was about keeping us together. Maybe I went too far. Maybe I broke something that can't be fixed. I hope you find peace, even if it's without me. Love, Mom. I stared at the word love. It looked out of place, like a word copied from someone else's vocabulary. I folded the letter carefully and set it beside my binder. Weeks passed. I heard from neighbors that she rarely left the house. The curtains stayed closed. The once loud woman who ruled every room now barely spoke. One Sunday, I received another call from Dad. She's selling the house, he said. Too much to keep up with. Maybe moving in with Lydia. I said nothing, only nodded to myself. The empire had finally fallen, but I didn't rejoice. The quiet victory felt more like closure than triumph. That evening, I went back to the commercial kitchen. The stainless steel counters gleamed under the fluorescent lights. I lit a small candle in the corner, more habit than ritual. As I prepared meals for the hospital patients, the rhythm of chopping and stirring steadied my breathing. Fire can destroy or feed. The difference lies in control. Around 10, I sat on the counter with a cup of tea, thinking of her. My mother, once unshakable, now crumbling beneath her own pride. Part of me mourned the mother I never had. Another part pitied the woman she had become. But mostly, I felt free. Later that night, I opened the lighter Dad had given me and flicked it on. The flame burned low and steady, reflecting in the window. Outside, the wind carried faint echoes of the chime from the old house, distant but familiar. It no longer sounded like pain. It sounded like ending. I whispered to the flame, "Goodbye, Mom." This time, it wasn't anger. It was release. It began with an email from Ethan marked urgent. Subject line, unauthorized account activity. My stomach sank as I read the details. Someone had attempted to access my savings account, my joint credit card from years ago, and even my online payroll profile. The IP address traced back to Cincinnati, the same city where Lydia's restaurant used to operate. I stared at the screen, unsurprised but still exhausted. It wasn't enough that she'd lost her business. She needed to take from me again, as if the pattern couldn't die unless she fed it. I called Ethan immediately. He sounded calm but firm. "I've already contacted the bank's fraud department. They'll freeze your accounts temporarily while we secure everything. Do you want to press charges?" I hesitated. Part of me wanted to, part of me was just tired. "Let's wait until we confirm it's her," I said, but I already knew it was. That night, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You think you can just erase me?" It was followed by another. "You stole everything. You'll regret this." I turned the phone off and sat in the dark, listening to my own heartbeat. Fear tried to creep in, but anger kept it at bay. The next morning, 2 detectives visited my apartment to take my statement. They were polite, efficient, and almost apologetic when they told me the attempted logins matched Lydia's devices. One of them, a woman with kind eyes, said quietly, "Family cases are the hardest. But you did the right thing." That sentence sat heavy in my chest. Doing the right thing doesn't feel like victory. It feels like surgery necessary but painful. By Friday, Lydia was formally charged with attempted identity theft. It wasn't a dramatic arrest. She turned herself in, escorted by a lawyer and flanked by cameras from the local news station. Her eyes looked wild behind the makeup, her mouth twisting into half a smile when a reporter shouted, "Any comment?" She said nothing. That night, my inbox filled with messages, some from strangers, some from old friends, all offering sympathy or judgment. One said, "She's still your sister, you know." I deleted it without replying. Family by blood doesn't mean bond by loyalty. A week later, the hearing took place. I sat in the back of the courtroom while Lydia stood before the judge trembling. The prosecutor read the charges: 3 counts of attempted fraud, 1 count of unauthorized access to a financial institution. She pleaded guilty to a lesser charge in exchange for probation. The judge's voice was steady. "Ms. Caldwell, you will complete 6 months of supervised community service and mandatory counseling." Lydia nodded, her face pale mascara smudged. When the session ended, she turned and saw me. For a long moment, we just stared. She looked like a reflection I'd stepped out of years too late. I walked outside the winter air biting through my coat. Snow had started to fall soft and relentless. I stood on the courthouse steps, breathing it in. Lydia followed her shoes crunching behind me. "You didn't have to come," she said bitterly. I glanced at her. "You didn't have to steal." Her jaw clenched. "I was desperate. You took everything." I shook my head. "I took back what was mine." "There's a difference." She laughed, the sound brittle. "You think you're better now, but you're still alone. You'll always be alone." The words were meant to wound, but they didn't. Alone wasn't a curse anymore. It was a boundary. I looked at her with quiet clarity. I'd rather be alone than surrounded by people who love the version of me they can control. Her expression cracked for a second, revealing something raw beneath the anger. Shame, maybe grief. Then she turned away, walking toward her car, shoulders hunched against the snow. I watched until she disappeared down the street. For the first time, I didn't feel hatred, just distance. In the weeks that followed, the news faded, replaced by newer scandals. Lydia started her community service at a food pantry 2 towns over. Occasionally, I'd hear updates through mutual acquaintances. She was quieter now, less polished, more tired. Some said she'd moved into a small apartment near Mom, who rarely left her own anymore. I didn't check. Healing meant not reopening every wound for inspection. Still, one evening as I left work, I found a small envelope taped to my car window. No return address, just my name. Inside was a folded piece of paper handwritten in Lydia's uneven script. "You were right. About Mom, about everything. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know I'm sorry." I stared at the note for a long time before tucking it into my pocket. I didn't cry. I didn't reply either. Some apologies are meant to exist without answers. That night, I drove home through the quiet streets, the city lights blurring through the windshield. In my apartment, I lit a candle and placed the note beside it. The flame flickered its reflection, dancing across the paper like a heartbeat. I whispered softly to the empty room, "I forgive you, but I'm not coming back." The words felt like exhaling years of tension. Somewhere in that same town, my sister was probably staring at her own flame, realizing too late that control and love were never the same thing. I didn't wish her pain. I wished her peace, even if it came slower than mine. The final court date came on a Monday morning, the kind of gray, overcast day that makes everything feel suspended in time. I arrived early, sitting in the hallway outside the courtroom with my binder balanced on my knees. Inside were all the documents that had once defined my nightmare and now represented its ending. Ethan sat beside me calm as ever, reviewing notes while sipping coffee. "You did everything right," he said without looking up. "Now we just close the chapter." I nodded, my fingers tracing the edge of the binder. Across the hall, Lydia and Mom sat together whispering. Mom looked frail, her hair thinner, her face pale without makeup. Lydia avoided my eyes. For a brief moment, I almost pitied them, but pity was a luxury I'd learned to outgrow. When the clerk opened the doors, we entered quietly. The judge glanced through the files, then addressed the room. After reviewing the agreements and settlements, the court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Ms. Emma Caldwell. Ownership and restitution terms are finalized as submitted. Lydia Caldwell will transfer all due payments within 60 days. The house at 24 Birch Street remains the sole property of Ms. Caldwell. The words were simple procedural, but they hit like thunder. It was done. Years of quiet labor humiliation and silence condensed into one official sentence. I was no longer invisible. Ethan leaned over and whispered, "Congratulations, Emma." I exhaled slowly, my chest loosening. When the gavel struck, it didn't sound like judgment. It sounded like peace. Lydia started crying softly, her shoulders shaking. Mom sat rigid, eyes forward, refusing to look at me. As the judge dismissed us, I stood and turned toward them. There was no satisfaction, only finality. Outside, the air smelled like rain again, but lighter, cleaner. Ethan handed me a manila envelope, the signed final orders. "You can frame it if you want," he joked softly. I smiled faintly. "No, I'll just keep it somewhere quiet. We walked to the courthouse steps and he paused. You know, most people never make it this far. They give up halfway because it hurts too much. I looked up at the gray sky. It still hurt, but at least the pain was honest now. He nodded. Take care of yourself, Emma. You've earned it. He left me their binder in one hand, orders in the other, standing between the courthouse and the horizon of a life I could finally call mine. I drove home with the windows cracked open, the wind carrying the faint scent of wet earth. When I parked in front of my apartment, I sat there for a while, letting the quiet settle in. There were no calls from Mom, no texts from Lydia. Just silence, deep and clean. Inside, the kitchen gleamed with order. My counters were lined with labeled jars, each one neat, every space intentional. I set the court papers down beside the candle and lit it. The flame rose steady golden against the afternoon gray. Steam curled from the kettle on the stove, a gentle hiss filling the room. I began chopping vegetables for soup, my knife moving in a rhythm that felt almost meditative. The smell of onions and rosemary filled the air. It was the same scent from the night everything began, but it no longer belonged to Payne. It belonged to me. I plated the meal, sat at the small table, and ate slowly, tasting every bite. There was no one to impress, no one to scold, no one to compare me to. Just me and the quiet I'd earned. Halfway through the meal, I laughed softly because it hit me. This was the first time I'd ever eaten in peace in my own kitchen. The fire now warmed. It didn't warn. After dinner, I opened the window. Outside, the wind brushed through the maple trees, carrying faint echoes of children playing somewhere down the street. Life was continuing without me needing to fix it or chase it. I thought about Grandma again, about what she'd said years ago. Kindness becomes power when everyone else forgets how to be decent. I whispered a thank you to her memory. She'd been right all along. Around sunset, I pulled out a notebook and began to write, not a report, not evidence, just thoughts. Healing isn't loud. It's measured like simmering broth. It doesn't boil. It deepens. I closed the notebook and poured myself a glass of wine. The candle flame swayed slightly in the breeze, then steadied. My phone buzzed once. A text from an unknown number. I heard you're doing well. I hope it lasts. I didn't need to guess who it was. Lydia trying to rewrite her tone. I typed back a single line. It already has. Then I turned off my phone and stepped outside onto the balcony. The city lights shimmered in the distance, soft and quiet. Somewhere beyond that horizon was the old house, the restaurant, the chaos all fading into memory. Behind me, the scent of garlic and rosemary still lingered, but this time it wasn't a trigger. It was comfort. I whispered to myself, it wasn't victory. It was peace. The kind you cook slowly with no one watching. The kind you taste and finally understand. I stayed there until the stars appeared small and cold but constant. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to prove anything. Justice had already spoken. The rest was just living. It took me months to realize that silence can sound different when it's chosen. The same quiet that once suffocated me now felt like breathing. I began my mornings with coffee instead of tension, with peace instead of apology. The kitchen became my sanctuary again, not a battlefield. The light through the blinds each dawn felt like a reward, gentle, forgiving, new. One Saturday, while organizing files on my laptop, I found the old folder labeled The Caldwell Project. My cursor hovered over it for a moment before I opened it. Page after page of evidence, timestamps, and transactions filled the screen, proof of every wound disguised as a favor. I scrolled through each file slowly, not to relive it, but to understand how far I'd come. These weren't just documents, they were monuments of survival. By the time I reached the last file, I didn't feel anger or sorrow, just gratitude. Gratitude for the strength that had grown quietly in me all those years. Gratitude for the version of myself who had endured until she could finally speak. I renamed the folder The Price of Silence and archived it. I didn't delete it. Some histories aren't meant to be erased. They're meant to remind you why you never go back. That night I wrote about it. Not for a legal report, not for closure, just for truth. I started with a single line. I was cooking dinner when my mother slapped me. The rest came naturally flowing like confession and liberation all at once. I wrote about the comparisons, the control, the slap, the reclaiming, about what it costs to love people who only understand ownership. When I finished, I posted it on a blog I'd kept private for years. I didn't expect anyone to read it. By morning, there were hundreds of comments. By evening, thousands. Messages poured in from strangers across the country, people who'd lived their own versions of my story. A woman from Wisconsin wrote, "Your story gave me courage to tell my husband no for the first time." Another from Texas said, "My mother used to call me useless too. I thought it was just me." The flood of empathy was overwhelming. For years, I'd been convinced my pain was an isolated event, but it wasn't. It was a pattern that lived in countless kitchens, whispered through generations. One message stood out from a retired teacher in Maine. "You taught me that justice doesn't always need noise. Sometimes it just needs someone to stop being quiet." I read that line over and over until it imprinted on my mind. That night, I lit a candle and watched the flame reflect in the window. It didn't feel like ritual anymore. It felt like conversation with myself, with everyone who had survived something similar. A week later, an online publication reached out asking to share my story under a new series called When Family Turns Toxic. I hesitated. For years, I'd hidden everything behind professionalism, behind the tidy title of nutrition scientist. Exposing it felt dangerous. But then I remembered how it had started with a slap no one acknowledged, with silence mistaken for peace. I agreed. The story went viral within days. Thousands of shares, interviews, requested podcasts inviting me to speak. I declined most of them. Fame wasn't the point. Healing was. Still, one evening I agreed to record a short video reading the story aloud. My voice didn't shake. "They said I'd never cook like my sister," I said into the camera. They were right. I cook with peace now, not pain. The comment section filled with voices that mirrored mine. Some angry, some relieved, all human. And for the first time, I didn't feel small. I felt part of something larger, something that mattered. I didn't just win a case. I reclaimed a voice. In the months that followed, I expanded my small meal prep business into a program for domestic abuse survivors learning independence. We called it Fire Kitchen because fire can destroy, but it can also nourish. Every Friday, we held group dinners where no one had to apologize for existing. Women laughed again. Men cooked side by side with them. Children stirred batter without fear. Each new flame in that kitchen was another story finding warmth instead of warning. One evening, a young woman named Laura lingered after class. She looked at me with wide, uncertain eyes. "How did you forgive them?" she asked. I thought for a long moment before answering. I stopped trying to. Forgiveness. I told her isn't the same as freedom. Sometimes it's just a chain with prettier words. She nodded slowly, tears glistening but calm. As she left, I looked around the kitchen, pots gleaming, steam rising, laughter echoing off the walls. This was what healing looked like, messy, alive, ongoing. Later that night, I recorded the closing voiceover for my story. The mic caught the softness in my tone, the steadiness I'd fought to earn. Every family has a recipe I began. Some feed you, some starve you, and some teach you to cook alone until you learn that peace tastes better than approval. I paused, letting the silence hold weight before continuing. If you've ever been hurt by the people who were supposed to protect you, drop your city and local time below. Tell me where you're watching from and I'll light a candle for you from Ohio, because justice begins when silence ends. The upload button blinked on my screen. I clicked it. The video went live. The first comment appeared within seconds. "Watching from Portland, 9:17 p.m. I thought I was the only one. The next said, "Boston, 6:17 p.m. Thank you for saying what I couldn't." Then came hundreds more cities times emojis of candles and hearts and flames. It was more than engagement. It was connection. Each timestamp was a heartbeat, proof that none of us were really alone. I watched the feed scroll endlessly, the glow from the monitor painting my face in soft light. Behind me, the candle burned steady, casting shadows that danced across the walls like ghosts finally at rest. Outside, the night deepened. The city hummed softly, unaware that somewhere in a small kitchen in Ohio, A woman who used to flinch at every sound now stood fearless in her own silence. I whispered to myself, "They said I'd never cook like my sister. They were right. I cook with peace, not pain." And for the first time, I smiled, not because the story ended, but because it had finally begun on my terms. If you're still here listening, maybe you've seen a piece of yourself somewhere in this story. Maybe not the slap, not the kitchen, but the silence that followed it, the kind that hums louder than shouting. You know that kind of quiet, the one that tells you to shrink so others can feel comfortable. I lived there once. I built my life around their peace while mine starved. And if you're nodding right now, it means you've been there too, standing in that invisible space between loyalty and survival. Let me tell you something that took me years to learn. Survival isn't selfish. You're allowed to walk away from what hurts you even if it shares your last name. I thought speaking out would destroy everything. Instead, it built the version of me that could finally breathe. The truth is, justice doesn't always wear a uniform or walk into courtrooms. Sometimes it stands barefoot in a kitchen holding a wooden spoon instead of a weapon, whispering, "No more." If you've ever had to whisper that to yourself, then you already understand. This isn't about revenge. It's about reclamation of dignity, of voice, of peace. Maybe tonight, you're watching from your own kitchen, staring at a counter that holds too many memories. Maybe it's quiet where you are, or maybe someone else is still trying to make you smaller with their words. Wherever you are, I want you to do one thing. Look around that room. Find one thing that's yours, the cup, the candle, the breath in your lungs, and claim it. Say quietly, "This belongs to me." That's where healing begins. Not in forgiveness, not in approval, but in ownership of yourself. And if you've ever been told you're too sensitive, too emotional, too defiant, I want you to know that those were never flaws. They were alarms. Your sensitivity was your intuition trying to keep you safe. Your emotion was your truth trying to be heard. Your defiance was your freedom learning to walk. Don't bury them. Honor them. They kept you alive. So here's my ask. If you've ever been hurt by someone who should have loved you, better drop your city and your local time below. Let me know where you're watching from so I can light a candle for you tonight from Ohio, from the same kitchen that used to feel like a cage. I'll light it for the mothers who couldn't say sorry, for the daughters who learned how to cook peace instead of pain, for the sons who were told not to cry but did anyway. Tell me your time, your place, your silence, and I'll meet you there in spirit. Because healing isn't lonely anymore. It's shared. It's real. And if you hear one thing from me tonight, let it be this. You are not what they said you were. You are what you survived. Justice begins when silence ends.